Welcome to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. I'm Nik Michael. Today, I want to talk about something that quietly shapes nearly every decision we make. It's something we all experience, and yet most of us never learn to recognize it while it's happening. It's called cognitive dissonance. Don't let the term scare you off. A psychologist named Leon Festinger named it back in 1957, and almost 70 years later, it's still one of the most useful ideas in psychology because it explains something we all live with but rarely name. Cognitive dissonance is simply the discomfort we feel when two parts of our reality stop matching. What we believe and what we do come apart, and the mismatch creates tension. Here's the part that matters most. When that tension shows up, most of us don't reach for behavior change. We reach for a better story. We become remarkably skilled at explaining why the mismatch is fine. We rationalize, we justify, we minimize, we compare ourselves to someone doing worse. We promise ourselves tomorrow will be different. In other words, we spend more energy making the discomfort go away than we spend actually closing the gap that caused it. Take something as simple as smoking. Someone believes smoking is harmful to their health, and yet they light another cigarette every day. Those two realities don't fit together, and the mind has exactly three ways to handle it. It can change the behavior and quit. It can change the belief, deciding the health risks are exaggerated, or it can bring in a justification from the side, something like, my grandfather smoked until he was 95. Notice that none of those three moves are really about accuracy. They're about restoring the feeling of being consistent with yourself, whether or not the story is true. We do this everywhere, not just with cigarettes. Someone says, my health really matters to me. And at the same time, they're eating poorly, sleeping 4 hours a night, and never moving their body. Health matters, says one part of them. Not enough to change anything, says the behavior. That gap creates discomfort, and the discomfort gets handled with a familiar script. I've just been busy. Things will calm down next month. I have good genetics. It's not that bad. Or someone says family comes before everything, and yet they're unavailable every weekend on their phone through dinner, missing the moments that actually make up a family. Rather than closing the gap, the mind offers a rescue. I'm doing all of this for my family, and maybe there's some truth folded into that. But sometimes the explanation becomes a way of not looking directly at the conflict underneath it. Money works the same way. I really need to save. I really need to save. Then a new purchase, another upgrade, another trip, and almost instantly the mind starts working on your behalf. I deserve it. It was on sale. I'll make it up next month. None of that is really about truth. It's about relief. And maybe the most familiar version of all shows up in relationships. Someone wants something healthier and keeps choosing partners who treat them poorly or stays somewhere they already know isn't good for them. A friend finally asks, why are you still there? And the answer that comes back usually isn't logical at all. It's emotional. Things aren't always bad. They had a hard childhood. They'll change. I don't want to start over. Every one of those sentences buys a little relief. None of them resolves anything. The conflict is still sitting exactly where it was. And here's what tends to happen next. When that conflict doesn't get resolved, it doesn't just disappear. It moves. It shows up as anxiety, as irritability, as exhaustion, as a heaviness that looks like depression, as resentment aimed at people who didn't cause it. Our minds are extraordinary at justifying almost anything. Our bodies generally keep the more honest record. I think of cognitive dissonance as something closer to an internal alarm system than a thought. It goes off emotionally as a vague sentence that something isn't right. It goes off cognitively when you notice you're repeating the same explanation for the 100th time and it's starting to sound thin even to you. And it goes off physically in a knot in the stomach. tight shoulders, a night where sleep won't come, a restlessness that has no obvious source. That alarm is not the enemy, it's information. It's your own system telling you, pay attention here. Most of us were trained to shut the alarm off instead of listening to it. We distract, we stay busy, we scroll, we overwork, we overeat, we drink a little more than we mean to. We find someone to blame. Anything that quiets that tension faster than actually addressing what caused it. But the discomfort is asking a real question underneath all the noise. Is the life you're living actually consistent with the person you're trying to become? That's a very different question than how do I stop feeling this? Discomfort isn't always the problem to be solved. Sometimes it's the evidence that you're growing. Sometimes it's simply the sound of you finally being honest with yourself. This is where the clinical world offers a few different maps, and I think it's worth naming them because they show up constantly in the therapy room. A cognitive approach tends to focus on identifying the specific thoughts that are popping up, the inconsistency, and challenging whether they're actually true. An acceptance-based approach takes a different angle. It's less interested in eliminating the discomfort and more interested in helping someone act in line with their values, even while the uncomfortable thought or feeling is still present. And a Gestalt therapy approach, which is the tradition I was trained in, tends to slow down and listen to the internal dialogue itself. The part of you that wants comfort talking to the part of you that wants integrity, bringing that conversation into full awareness rather than letting it run in the background where it quietly shapes everything. Different roads, different maps, but they're all circling the same destination. How do we help a person become more congruent? How do we shrink the distance between what someone values and how they're actually living? And that's where I think the real pivot point exists. The pivot point isn't the moment life falls apart. It isn't the diagnosis or the divorce or the day you get let go. Those moments can force change, but they're not where change actually begins. The pivot point happens earlier and quieter than that. It happens the moment your own explanations stop convincing even you. When you hear yourself give the same justification for the 100th time and something in you no longer buys it. When your body keeps sending the same signal. When your values and your behavior are finally standing face to face with nowhere left to look but at each other. In the therapy room, this often sounds deceptively simple. I know what I should do, but I just can't do it. I value honesty, but I lied because I felt like I had no choice. I want closeness, but I keep pushing people away the moment they get close. Every one of those sentences is cognitive dissonance speaking in plain language. And the work isn't to rush in and resolve the sentence. The work is to stay with it long enough to actually understand it instead of explaining it away in the first 30 seconds the way we usually do. That's the real shift. Awareness always comes before change. First awareness, then choice, then action. And the quiet tragedy is that so many people get all the way to awareness and stop there. They know, they just don't move. Instead, they negotiate. After the holidays, when work slows down, when the kids get older, when I have more money, when I feel more confident, there's always one more condition, one more reason the timing isn't quite right yet. This is where something called the arrival fallacy quietly takes over. The arrival fallacy is the belief that a future moment will finally resolve what the present moment won't. When the kids get older, when I change jobs, when I retire, when this project is finished. Each of those sentences sounds like patience. It sounds responsible, even wise, but underneath it, something else is happening. The person isn't actually planning to close the gap between their values and their behavior. They're relocating the gap to a future version of themselves, one who will supposedly have the time, the energy, or the courage that feels unavailable right now. The problem is that arrival never quite arrives. The kids get older, and there's a new reason. The job changes, and the discomfort simply repacks itself into different language. Retirement comes, and the same unresolved tension is standing there waiting, except now with less time to do anything about it. The arrival fallacy doesn't reduce cognitive dissonance, it only postpones it, and it postpones it with a reckoning. And in the meantime, it does something important. It increases the distance between what you believe and how you're living, because every day spent waiting for the future moment is another day. The gap gets a little more familiar, a little more normal, a little easier to live inside of. That's also why awareness alone so often fails to produce change. A person can see the gap clearly, even name it out loud in a therapy session, and still not move, because the arrival fallacy hands them a socially acceptable reason to wait. Nobody questions when the kids are older. Nobody questions when I retire. Those phrases sound like wisdom, not avoidance, which is exactly what makes them so effective at delaying the one thing that would actually resolve the dissonance. The discomfort gets a future address, and the present moment gets permission to stay exactly the same. At some point, more honest questions are needed. Why haven't I changed? It's what I am protecting by staying exactly the same. Because staying the same is never neutral. It's always serving some purpose. It protects you from uncertainty, from rejection, from failure. Sometimes, strangely, it even protects you from success. Once you can name what staying the same is actually protecting, the whole problem looks different and often a little more forgivable. And that opens the door to the only question that actually moves anything forward. What action would bring my behavior into closer alignment with the person I'm trying to become? Notice what that question doesn't ask. It doesn't ask how you feel about it. It doesn't ask what happens if you fail. It doesn't ask what anyone else will think. It asks for one honest next step toward alignment. Not the perfect action, not the whole transformation all at once, just the next one. Because real change is almost never one dramatic decision. It's usually a long series of smaller ones, each of them nudging your life a little closer to who you actually are. That, to me, is the entire idea behind a pivot point. It's the moment awareness turns into responsibility. The moment insight turns into choice. The moment the explanation finally gives way to the action and your life starts moving again. Not because your circumstances changed, but because you did. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Pivot Point Strategy for Change. If any of this landed for you, I'd ask you to sit with one question this week. Where in your life have your actions quietly stopped matching your values? You may find the answer isn't something to be afraid of. It might just be the beginning of your next pivot point. I leave you with the one question I like to ask at the end of every episode. Think about it. What is your pivot point? What's your pivot point?